I spoke about form in general and the form of a poem specifically. I said to be a poem, you have to have a recognizable form. You have to be recognized as functioning as a poem is supposed to function. Of course, you are never so aware of the form as when that form is being violated in some way. For example, I spoke about how the poem is composed in iambic tetrameter, which is hardly the cutting edge in metrical experimentation. Rather, it strikes us as a cliche, the way that poetry is supposed to be written. Rather, it reminds us that form itself is a conservative phenomenon and attempts to reimpose itself upon us every time, in the case of a poem, that we hear a poem. Of course, we grow rebellious when a form is constantly reimposed upon us, and so we're even more inclined to violate that form. In the case of the first two stanzas, iambic tetrameter is continued, but it is abandoned in lines 3 and 4. As I said in a previous video, not only does it abandon tetrameter, it abandons any meter whatsoever. Lines 3 and 4 are unpoetic, apoetic. It's a prose line, and a rather ugly line at that. From a poetic standpoint, it is in and of itself slovenly. But just as quickly as meter, the tetrameter, was abandoned, it is reestablished in lines 5 and 6. The police, as it were, quell the riot, and form is reestablished. Now, new form itself cannot come into being without a violation of old form. And it was in the jar itself that we saw these form-creating violations. The jar, of course, has its ordinary attributes and function. In fact, some of the attributes of the jar are so ordinary, it almost doesn't seem to make sense to mention them. For example, jars are almost always round. At least when we speak about the jar in its most conservative form. So the statement, "and round it was," is a way of saying, "and it was a most conservatively formed jar." The jar contains. It has contents. To say that you contain is that you hold within yourself. Now, the fact of containing also entails a forming, as the contents are necessarily, to some extent, going to have to take the form of the jar. Now, in lines 3 and 4, which occasioned a violation of the established meter of the poem, there is also a violation of the function, or in the function of the jar. What was a passive effect of its jarness becomes almost an act on the part of the jar to compel the wilderness to take a specific form. But now, when we get to lines 5 and 6, there has been a return to the abandoned meter. In the same sense, the jar has returned to containing. Now, there's been a light shift here because containing also means to set a limit upon something else, which certainly is not as aggressive as the action described was in lines 3 and 4, but neither is it so passive as mere holding something within it. So the poem gives an experience of a form in being imposed, and as though in rebellion, a violation against that form. As I said, when we experience form being imposed upon us, we are going to have a tendency to perform a violation. Additionally, if new form is being created, that means that there has to be an implicit violation of an old form. I liken this to this metaphor. The jar in the poem is the grain of sand inside of the oyster's hard shell, irritating the soft tissues within and provoking the creation of a pearl. I also thought of another metaphor. The jar in the poem is Eve's awareness of the forbidden fruit, provoking her to violate the rule imposed upon her and to gain knowledge and power. The consequence, of course, was the fall, the expulsion from the garden into the wilderness, and all of the attendant suffering and pain. Now, ultimately, from this abasement of the wilderness, human beings established civilization and culture, and that series of forms that itself, just as the original God of the garden, imposes rules upon themselves, with violations expected and punishments clearly stated, spelled out. And isn't that just what happened in lines 5 and 6 when order was reestablished? The wilderness rose up to it. It was contained by the jar, given a form by the jar, and was no longer wild, was prepared to obey the rules once again. In the case of humankind, obeying the rules that they themselves imposed upon themselves. I'd also like to connect Eve's awareness of the forbidden fruit with the I in the first line. The I is the speaker, and I placed. To place something, as I said, implies careful consideration, forethought, careful execution. It speaks an intention to change something, to rearrange something, to violate an existing form, and to create a new form. I believe the I as an active agent in the poem disappears, and the jar as the active agent in the poem appears, because the jar, if you want to put it this way, in the poem represents the intention within a larger context. The jar is a generator of stories, if you will. You could say that the jar is a generator of stories. It's what happens when the mind grows aware of the world and intends. And let's continue. As I said, in stanza 2, you have a reestablishment of the form, but this phrase, "a port in air," is not, at least not in my estimation, is not English. As I wrote here, it's a word-for-word rendering of this French phrase, which means a door of air, which of course is an absurdity because you can't impose form upon air. But a port in air is, maybe more importantly than this absurdity, is a violation of the rules of English. So again, we have a violation in the context of a reestablished form. And as I said before, the jar is a locus of tension between form and violations of form. Thus, of a port in air is a prepositional phrase that is attributed to the jar properly, because a port in air is itself an occasion in the violation of the rules of English, creating a new phrase. Of course, to say that the jar is of a port in air suggests a joke in that if the port in air is a mistranslation of a door in air, well, what is a door in air? It is a door that by its nature can only be open. And you could never say that a door of air is ever ajar. A jar means slightly open, and of course, something that is completely open and can only be open can never be said to be merely open a little bit. I'm not certain if Stevens intended that, but it gives me a chuckle anyway. Now, this is admittedly a very, very subtle violation, which may suggest that the form has become so dominant. Well, look at the first line of the third stanza. It took dominion everywhere. It assumed complete and total control, almost in a totalitarian way, of everything. A jar contains so completely that it places limits on everything, and with that, we have a dead form. The next line says as much. The jar was gray and bare. Gray suggests the dying, the moribund, and bare represents having no adornment, perhaps having no qualities whatsoever. Of course, you can only observe that the jar was gray and bare if you are outside of the jar, which is remarkable since the previous line said the jar took dominion everywhere, that the world was contained by the jar. But that suggests that the world defined and constrained by that jar is dead, and as a result, that jar is merely a relic, an artifact of a dead world. The world from which we view it is foreign to that world. We view the jar from outside, from the perspective of a world that the jar is not part of, and a world that is in no way constrained by that jar. You could think of the jar as perhaps being nothing more than an amphora in the museum, that Greek jar that was used for food storage. Although once it preserved food, the typical function of a jar, now it just preserves something of that dead world. But can a jar that is slipping into oblivion again function as an occasion of form and violation? Well, as the last two lines point out, only in the negative sense. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. There is something like a violation in these two lines. In the context of the poem, in stanza 1, we had a violation of meter, and in stanza number 2, we had a violation of English usage. And in these last two lines, we have a near violation of grammar. This is, at the very least, very awkwardly put. It is almost an irritation for irritation's sake. It certainly cannot function as the grain of sand irritating the soft inner tissue of the oyster to provoke the formation of the beautiful pearl. Here we simply take up all of the non-capabilities of the jar. In the most literal sense of this statement, it did not reproduce the living world. Secondly, bird or bush suggests that classic organizing scheme of animal, vegetable, or mineral by which we are taught to organize our world, at least as school children. Thus, it can't provide a key for distinguishing this thing from that thing. It provides no way to identify anything at all. Third, bird or bush suggests the saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So it seems to suggest that it doesn't even provide proverbial wisdom, those rules of thumb to aid us in life, which is that dead knowledge that is passed down as sayings, which by simply repeating in a most unreflective way, we preserve in our language, that repository of cliched dead knowledge. But when we read that this is like nothing else in Tennessee, it suggests that it made a virtue of its non-capabilities, because like nothing else suggests that something is exemplary or singular, and therefore admirable. But this means that the jar, in its role, failed. It did not transform Tennessee. It, at most, is abstract, it's rarefied, its beauty is strictly academic, and has nothing to speak to the people of Tennessee or people anywhere else. But it's not a failure, it's simply the logical conclusion of form. When form becomes entirely self-referential and excludes everything else, it is dead. So that is my three-part analysis of Anecdote of the Jar. I hope those who are watching it, other than me, who will probably rewatch it and think about it more, I hope that you all have found this an interesting exercise.